Hey guys, welcome to another portion of Straight Talk. We're going to be in Philippians Chapter 4 as we look at this last chapter to see what Paul is talking about to the congregation at Philippi. Now, if you remember, the end of chapter 3, he had said in verse 17, "Brothers, join in imitating me and keep your eyes on those who walk according to the example you have in us." So he starts reminding the brothers that they need to imitate him. He says in verse 18, "For many of whom I have often told you, and now tell you even with tears, walk as enemies of the cross of Christ. Their end is destruction. Their God is their belly, and they glory in their shame with minds set on earthly things." So he says, listen, you need to imitate me. You need to keep your eyes on people who imitate me. In other words, you need to help one another out in this imitation of me to walk this Christ-like life. And he points out who the enemies of the cross are. The enemies of the cross are those, he says, with minds set on earthly things. So as we think about our daily walk and how we should live on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Saturday, how we live each day in interacting with people, he says if your mind is set on earthly things, if that's what you're focused on, then you're an enemy of the cross. We need to get rid of the earthly things that control our thoughts and our minds and focus on godly things. And then to kind of re-emphasize that in our daily walk, he tells them about a couple of ladies in chapter 4. Excuse me. And he says there's these two ladies, and he names them, and he says, y'all need to come together and help these two ladies work out their differences. Help these women, he says in verse number 3. He says, because they've labored side by side with me in the gospel. He says, listen, this is not a matter of salvation when it comes to what they're upset about. They're upset about some earthly things. It's a personal matter that they're upset about. I don't know what it is, but Paul says, listen, this is not a doctrinal issue. What you need to do is come together and put aside whatever discrepancy it is and focus on godly things. And he's asking the congregation to help them come together and put aside their discrepancies. Paul says this because he knows that when you have infighting in a congregation, that can tear a congregation apart. So he's reminded them, if you're focusing on my life, if you're imitating me, then you're not focusing on these other things. Remember the past few chapters, he's talked about how we are to love. And so he says, listen, if we're loving our brother as ourselves, then we're not letting these personal issues interfere with our worship to God. We're not letting these personal issues interfere with our worship together in lifting one another up in Christ. He says in verse number 4 of this last chapter, rejoice in the Lord always. And again, I say rejoice. What does that mean? Well, he goes on to kind of explain that. He says, listen, don't be anxious about stuff, but in everything, in prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, let your requests be known to God. So if we're rejoicing in the Lord always, then we're always in prayer. We're always in thanksgiving to God. We're always giving thanks to God for what we have, what we've been blessed with. And he says in verse 7, and the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ. How is that peace of God going to guard our hearts and our minds? Only if we are constantly giving God thanks. Only if we are constantly going to God in prayer will He be guarding our hearts and our minds. You see, we have a part to play in guarding our hearts and our minds, and that is giving ourselves completely to God. If we're in a quarrel with someone, if we're fussing and fighting with someone, we're not guarding our hearts. We're not giving ourselves to God. If we're not imitating Paul's life, then we're not constantly in prayer, giving thanksgiving to God. And when we're not doing that, then our hearts and our minds are not being guarded. So if they're not being guarded, what does that mean? It means Satan has a way to get in. Satan can get into our hearts and our minds if it's not being guarded. So he says down in verse 9, what you have learned and received and heard and seen in me, practice these things, and the God of peace will be with you. If we're not practicing each day how to live our lives by actually doing the things that Paul's talking about, by loving our neighbor, by treating our neighbor with respect, by edifying our fellow brothers and Christians, by lifting them up instead of quarreling with them, he says if we're not doing those things, then we're not going to have the God of peace with us. Satan is going to have an avenue to get in our hearts, get in our minds, and cause us to act like a fool. That's what he's talking about. You see, Satan looks for opportunities to get into your heart and get into your mind and pull you away from being Christ-like. He wants to cause arguments. He wants to cause quarrels. He wants to cause hate and discontent in congregations as well as in families. And he does that by getting in your mind and in your heart. Paul says, don't let him do that. Don't fall into Satan's trap by doing that. The only way to prevent that from happening is to not give Satan any room. Don't give him any rope. Don't give him a crack to slip in. He says, rejoice in the Lord always. Always. We need to, in everything, by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, let our request known to God. We have to be living each day for God so that we don't give Satan a chance to get into our hearts and minds. And he says, listen, if we do that, he goes down to verse number 13, a popular verse that we love. He says, if we're doing these things, this is what Paul said, if you're doing this, then in 13 he says, I can do all things through him who strengthens me. You can do all things through Christ who strengthens you if you're abiding by God's laws. If you're living your life imitating Paul, you can do all things. Not that you can leap tall buildings, not that you're going to be the number one salesman in your group. It's not talking about that. It's talking about living a Christ-like life. You won't allow Satan into your mind and into your hearts because you can do all things through Christ who strengthens you. It's when we live a Christ-like life that we can do all that Christ knows we can do. You see, we're not relying on ourselves. We're not relying on our own abilities. We're relying on the power of Christ by submitting ourselves to him. The more we imitate Paul, you see, there's this transformation that takes place in our hearts and our minds. We're transformed daily to be like him. It's not going to happen unless we rejoice in the Lord always, and everything give prayer and supplication, giving thanks to God. You see, if we set our minds on Paul, on godly things, that's what we're going to be doing. But if we set our mind on worldly things, we're not going to be doing those things. We're going to be worried about the worldly things of this that Satan has to offer. We're going to focus on these things, these quarrels that come up between us and brethren because we're more concerned about worldly things than we are earthly things. Don't let Satan get into your heart and your minds. Don't give Satan an opportunity. Constantly be looking to God and constantly be going to him in prayer and thanksgiving. And then he won't have an opportunity to get into your mind. Listen, this is just straight talk. Straight talk from me to you. The Bible tells us that if you resist the devil, he'll flee from you. You see, he has no power over Christ. None. He does have power over you if you allow him to pull you away from Christ. But as long as your mind and heart is set on serving God, as long as you're a child of God, focusing on him, Satan can do nothing. Resist him. You can do it. Paul thinks you can do it. Jesus thinks you can do it. I know you can. That's just straight talk from me to you. Have a great day.